everyone in the audience for coming this evening. It's a great privilege to be able to return here to Iowa City, and I guess I would say, moreover, to find that there's interest for a topic of this type on a night when I'm sure many of you could either find better things to do, whether it be academic or otherwise. So I'm very pleased to see the great turnout. And as was kind of mentioned early on there by Alec in his presentation, Doctors Without Borders is a group that has a lot of experience in situations like this, and I'll get into some of the details of that in particular, as well as throw in a little bit of I guess I would say, background of my own mixed into this. And so without further ado, and hopefully we've got the technology part of this all figured out. There we go. Whoops, I already went too far. But disclaimer number one was supposed to be that I have no financial interests in anything. It's kind of thing something in the world of medicine that we increasingly need to verify that we're not under influences of any sort. And I might say, add there parenthetically, sadly, I don't have any outside financial interests to put up here. And number two, as the disclaimer, is that I'm not trying to serve as an official spokesperson for Doctors Without Borders. So in my relationship or my involvement with the group, we'll get into in just a little bit. But I don't want this to come across as I'm making a positional statement of Doctors Without Borders. Rather, I'm interpreting the experience I had with them, but I don't want any of this to be taken as this is their official policy or anything in that realm. Then disclaimer number three would be that I don't consider myself or don't want myself to be included in the group of people considered experts on the Middle East. And I don't want to be trying to present rather an overview that may give misinformation. And again, I'm guessing that there are many people in the audience who have quite a bit more knowledge, background, and expertise firsthand on the situation there and even in Syria in particular. But obviously I have maybe the perspective of having been there recently to add to what might exist in that regard. And that's sort of a lead-in to how did I become involved? How did I wind up going to Syria? And the answer is it was something as simple as a phone call and my own availability in a given time point. And someone saying initially the mission proposed to me was to go and work in the South Sudan for this 2-week period of time that started in the latter part of August and went on into the early part of September. And then that morphed into, well, the hospital really isn't ready. Would you be willing to go to Haiti and work in a project there? At which I said, yes, not a problem, and filling in for a surgeon on vacation. And that then didn't pan out. And then it was, would you mind going to Gaza? We've got a program there. And then as we talked about that, it really turned out that probably wasn't suiting my needs, and they were looking for somebody who's more of a plastic surgeon. So finally the call came and said, would you go to Syria? And my answer was yes, certainly. And so in preparation for that, I then did a little bit of scrambling to try to, find some sources to read and kind of try to make sense as best as I could of the situation, which obviously is, quite complex. And, like many people in the educational realm, my means of trying to bring that all into a more sharper focus was to make a diagram. And so what I came up with, whoops, I'm sorry, here I've just hit this now, if we may have a technical flaw that, there we go, good. That's all too easy. So I made a diagram, and and I think this is, something that, many of us have tried to do to bring clarity to a situation. And it was pretty easy here of the Syrian pro-government and the opposition forces. And then as I read, it was, all right, let's get the influences of Iran and the Soviet Union, Shiite versus Sunni, who was backing and influencing who, and where Al-Qaeda stood and so forth. And it started to make sense. And then as things evolved, then it was Vladimir Putin and his take on all of this, and the Edward Snowden affair. And the more I read, the more it seemed everything in the world could be tied into the situation in Syria. And I would say maybe as we get down to some of the periphery of this slide, it's exaggerating it slightly, but I think I would say pretty definitively, I think Al-Qaeda would take a very negative view of twerking, and so we'll leave it at that. So, and finally, before kind of getting into the main Your content of the presentation. There are a few slides that are somewhat graphic, and I think it's the nature of surgeons and surgical presentations to almost always have some of that drawn in, and I will try to give adequate warning to anybody in the audience if you feel like you wanted to close your eyes or otherwise not see something that may qualify as being a little bit too explicit from the surgical realm, but that's not the intent today, to have a large amount of presentation on kind of the particulars of what I was actually seeing or doing. And finally, on this, in that realm, photographs inside the country were very explicitly forbidden. And the reason for that was the concern that someone taking pictures inside the country would be viewed potentially as a spy or as someone who was trying to gather intelligence. And so there were numerous briefings that I had before I left, all very explicit. So sadly, if you were hoping to see a lot of slides of what does it look like inside Syria and the countryside and what did the hospital look like and what were the patients, I don't have much to present there. There's a very small number that you'll see of slides inside the country, but it just wasn't possible. So to begin, what I'd like to do is provide and sort of follow up on some of the comments that Alec made, but provide a little bit of the overview of Doctors Without Borders and their role in meeting the needs that exist in humanitarian crisis, and then examine more broadly the background of the situation in Syria and provide some details pertinent to that again, many of the people in attendance tonight are already familiar with. And then provide some details of my own experiences inside the country, and as well as some sentiments that one can't help but form based on time spent there. And again, in case it wasn't clear, we'll also have some time at the end of the session for questions and answers, because I think many times a presentation like this can't help but raise some questions that would come up. And I also just wanted to provide a bit of background about myself. And so I'm a practicing pediatric surgeon. I work at the University of Vermont, and so a facility that in some ways is not all that dissimilar to the University of Iowa. I've had a long-standing interest in global health, and early in my kind of effort to try to get exposure and experience working overseas and hopefully providing something that would qualify as a benefit for the individuals that I was serving, I took numerous trips to a whole variety of different countries, and including what's listed there, Haiti on 3 different occasions, to Cambodia, Guatemala, to the Gambia and West Africa and Ghana. And some of those trips were very productive, and I think I would say met the needs of the people that I was trying to be working with or serving, and to some degree one might call successful. And there were others that frankly might qualify almost in the words of misadventures. And what do I mean by that, or how could that be the case? Circumstances where I would get to a setting, and on one occasion that was quite memorable. It finished a fairly complex operation on a child, and then I said, okay, now what do we have available for pain medicine to give the child afterwards? And they said, well, the family's going to have to buy pain medicine if we don't have anything in the hospital. That's their responsibility. And another time it was getting a group of individuals lined up for surgery, and then saying, well, great, now I'd like to give antibiotics. That's kind of our customary practice. And again, saying, well, if you didn't bring the antibiotics, we really don't have any, and we're not sure we're going to be able to meet those needs. And so what left me with a little bit of a kind of a mixed sentiment about, gosh, ethically, does that make sense to be proceeding along and doing things that I might consider substandard when my intent was really to hopefully be providing care in a very positive, proactive, and as best as it could be accomplished state-of-the-art setting. And so based on some of those experiences, I then got interested specifically, in working with Doctors Without Borders. And taking things back even a step further, I think sometimes, people, and this is geared more towards the younger members of the audience, they say, well, how does somebody, get the background, the interest, or the wherewithal to do this? And they sort of presume that they're all individuals who are the offspring of ambassadors and grew up speaking 5 languages and, traveled the world 10 times before they were the age of 5. And in fact, I guess I would say there's some people who maybe didn't quite have their horizons quite that broad, who can wind up eventually morphing their way into doing that. So, I'm a native Midwesterner, and in that realm, here at the University of Iowa, I could, kind of give the standard thing that I think is still heard on the undergraduate campus, that if somebody said, "Where are you from?" the answer is, "Well, I'm from Chicago." And then the follow-up question, "Well, where in the city are you from?" And it kind of goes to, "Well, it's actually just outside of the city." "Oh, you mean like, Oak Lawn or Evanston?" "Well, no, a little further outside of the city." But so I'm one of the Palatine people. I don't know if anybody's from suburban Chicago, but the Northwest. And I would say growing up had really very little recognition of anything that existed outside of cornfields and the customary things that Illinois and Iowa are known for. In fact, had never traveled outside of the U.S. until I was 23, and kind of in the career realm had no interest in medicine until I was well into my junior year in college. And really, my global health interest spun out of experiences I had in medical school of going to South Africa. So I kind of put this slide in here as, I think, a bit of an introduction to say, first of all, many times career paths change and go different directions than you may anticipate. And B, even somebody from Palatine, Illinois can sometimes get outside a 10-mile radius of the city. And so moving on from there, what about working with MSF? So what specifically drew me to that organization? And I'd heard about it as early as 1993 and actually went through an application and interview process to work with them then. But they had a very strict mandate, which still largely exists today, that they wanted a minimum of a month of time for surgical people. And so that was frankly very difficult in terms of my career and other obligations that I had. And so it was only in 2009 that I had the opportunity to put myself in a position professionally where I could say, now, actually, I'm happy to come work for you, but I want to be able to have 1 to 2 months a year where I can also be working overseas and doing something different. So this is a little bit of a plug of saying, flexibility is increasingly the case for a lot of careers, but the possibility, whether in medicine or outside of medicine, of kind of making this a priority does exist. And as Alec mentioned in my introduction, the places I've been now on 6 different missions, including the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and that's in the eastern part of that country, twice. I was in Haiti, went over there just a couple weeks after the earthquake, in the Ivory Coast, in the Central African Republic, and then most recently here, just having gotten back about 3 weeks ago, in Syria. And Doctors Without Borders, and again, Alec provided a great introduction to this, but what was its genesis? How did it form? So it was primarily a group of healthcare workers who had been involved with the Red Cross and had been in Biafra. And for those of you who may not be aware of that, it was a conflict, and really, in essence, a civil war that existed inside of Nigeria in 1971, as in that early 70s era, is when it primarily came to the fore and was brought to the attention of the world primarily because the Nigerian government was for the population that was trying to advocate for independence, came down and really was very punitive to that population, as this slide shows, limiting food aid, and probably what was even worse still was that they were taking aid that was being sent into the country for this population and basically diverting it into either military or government purposes. And so this caused a lot of outrage, and the Red Cross, which is a wonderful charitable organization, but is very strict about saying they are not going to take any political stances on what's going on the ground. They view their mission to serve the needs of the human rights and to advocate for and provide for the populations in distress, but they do not make any statements about what they're seeing or what they're doing. And this group of French individuals within there and then came back and said, we need to do something different. And the concept of speaking out was something that they felt very strongly about and brought this to the attention of the world. And again, it's a whole other subject, but really in many ways was kind of the beginning, this crisis, the beginning of kind of humanitarian aid and NGOs on a large scale. There we go. So where is Doctors Without Borders, or MSF? And incidentally, if it wasn't clear, those terms are used kind of interchangeably here. Where do they, where do they work or function? And the answer is, as you can see from this slide, that it is primarily, in sub-Saharan Africa is where the bulk of it is. Now, if you said, well, what about what's going on up in Sweden or in France? Why are they involved in projects in those countries? They tend to be smaller scale projects that are geared towards refugee populations that are not adequately having their medical needs or other social needs met. But really, the bulk of the emphasis tends to be in sub-Saharan Africa. And as it may be a little hard to read for some of the people, towards the front of the room, I'm not sure, but presently there's about 25,000 people with the organization that are out in the field. And of those, only about 8% are international staff. And what does international staff mean? Well, that refers to people like me. So if some individuals who are outside the country where the actual aid or care is being provided. So you could say outsiders would be another term, or in the terminology that's used, expats or expatriates. So individuals who aren't citizens of that country. So at any given time, there's really only about 2,000 individuals who are from Europe, North America, or outside of the the area where the projects are being accomplished. And in turn, what that means is the bulk or the majority of the people who are providing care, who are actively involved in the process, are actually residents of the country where the care is being provided. And so that can be viewed in a couple of different ways, which I'll focus on a little bit more. I would say largely probably is more positive than negative, but certainly can have a little bit of a mixed message to it. And as you can see down here, 8.8 million outpatient consultations done. This is a few years back. More than 300,000 patients hospitalized. Surgically, the number is about 70,000 operations a year that the group is doing. And again, that number may not sound very great, but one of the issues that's a very big problem in global health is maldistribution of resources, and in particular in surgical care. The lowest third of the world's economic, or the population that's living in the world with the poorest economic indicators have only about 3% of the world's operations performed. And so there's this great maldistribution of care provided, but in particular in the surgical realm. And so again, obviously is a cause that's fairly near and dear to my own interests, but a big part of what they do, but certainly not exclusively what they do. And this slide demonstrates expenditures, and again, this is from 2008, so a little bit dated, but I'd like to, highlight probably, two particular portions of that. The first one is over here of what percentage of the funds go into the program's activity at 81.3%. What does that mean? Of a dollar raised, 80 cents is actually going to be going into the actual care, hands-on care, or supplies, resources that the population is going to be that you're trying to serve is going to be able to benefit from, versus the fundraising percent, which is up here, management up over here. And there are various organizations that rate charities or charitable organizations or NGOs in terms of what percentage of their funding goes into activities. And I can say that's quite good, and I think is something to always be kind of cautious about or looking at as you contemplate, might I want to be involved with someone and or even making a donation to someone. And in that regard, what does that translate from the standpoint of the individual working? It means basically that things are kind of bare bones. So there's a few times I've said to myself, gosh, I wish maybe that was 81.2% and I could have had an air conditioner in the room that I was staying in, or a little bit better meals, or a slightly more comfortable hotel room as I was traveling. But the reality is they keep things very bare bones at every level, and so at the end of the day, that's probably as most of us would want it to be, and one understands why that's the case. The other thing to see on this slide, which again I apologize if it's almost off the corner down here in the bottom left, but is total expenditures, and this is $1 billion a year organization, basically. That's the resources they have, and that's a figure that really provides a pretty sizable financial clout. And unlike some corporations that may have that as their income in a year, they're very good about, this isn't something they're trying to bankroll and have a 10-year stock of funds in their bank, but rather they're trying to spend that every year in a meaningful way. And so again, it really is a great thing to be able to have that degree of depth of investment in the organization, because it allows them to do a lot of things that I think are very difficult or challenging for other charitable organizations.
Show your Iowa pride, the Iowa Hawk Shop, where Iowa shops. The ultimate collection of Iowa Hawkeye merchandise, gifts, and apparel. Help support the University of Iowa. All proceeds benefit men's and women's athletic teams and student programs. The Iowa Hawk Shop, where Iowa shops. Show your Iowa pride. Call 1-800-HAWK-SHOP or visit www.hawkshop.com.
So what kinds of areas are they in, and where do they work, and how, what sort of activities are they involved in? And many of these things are fairly well known. Obviously, armed conflicts is very pertinent to what I'll be talking about, more specifically here soon in Syria. But it's also been in other places, and certainly in the Congo. Can you call that a war anymore? And the answer is it's kind of hard to know how to describe it. It's more of kind of a chronic crisis, ongoing, rebel engagement, but that, has gone on for a decade. But, areas like that are certainly a very important part of what they've been doing, and has been an area of long-standing involvement. Malnutrition and the problems related to that is also something that they're involved in, and whether that's healthcare within that, provision of water sources, of food, but a whole variety of elements there. Epidemics, and here they have kind of, I think, a unique advantage over a lot of organizations, is that they have been established in so many of the most impoverished countries in the world for such an extended period that they have active centers in the capitals or larger cities of so many countries. And so if an epidemic breaks out, what you need then is a rapid mobilization of resources, and then be able to distribute those resources. But in epidemics in particular, and vaccines, you need to maintain what's called a cold chain, which is that the vaccine, if it gets to a certain temperature and isn't given to a patient fairly quickly, won't be effective. And so they are, very well set up in terms of having internal networks inside of countries and means of doing that, just because they've been in so many places that have been chronically disadvantaged. Then natural disasters, and again, is an area I think that gets a lot of publicity and that people tend to think of for groups like Doctors Without Borders. But the earthquake in Haiti was one that I had personal experience in, and would just say that it kind of reiterating some of the comments I just made. They had numerous hospitals inside Haiti that they'd been working, and were able to mobilize staff, individuals, supplies inside the country, very quickly, and do what I think would qualify as a very good job of getting that of their surgical activities and other medical activities up to speed. And again, there were a number of very well-intentioned individuals who went to Haiti after the earthquake and then would get someplace and they'd say, oh my gosh, I didn't realize we were going to have a water supply to be able to do surgery or to provide care to these patients, but a variety of logistical things that they do very well that, again, which isn't to say that others can't do, but they, I think, have a particular facility in this area. Primary health care clinics, which again is kind of, I think, that would say the foundation of health care in almost any setting, is that one needs to be able to meet the basic needs of more common and straightforward problems, and again is something that they certainly emphasize as well. And mobile clinics, getting out into remote areas of countries where travel is a challenge, again, something that they often are able to accomplish in this networking out into to countries that ordinarily don't have great transportation systems. Hospital support is another big part of it, and an aspect that I guess I would say is working in the surgical venue, I've been able to benefit tremendously from. So the example I can give of the hospital that I worked in the Eastern Congo had been a government hospital, and MSF had been there, I think, for about 6 or 7 years before I first worked there. But they'd said that when they arrived on the scene in the 2002 or in that realm, there had been 2 nurses that were the sole care providers in this hospital that basically had the capacity for about 300 patients. And basically when MSF came in, they provided equipment, materials, but also personnel and a budget for maintaining an adequate pharmacy, the operating room, getting equipment, supplies in there. And so having recently been back there in the end of June, that's now a 550-bed hospital that had 32 physicians, I think, and the majority of those being Congolese. But it was a completely different dynamic, and again, they are still providing support, but the hope being that they'll be able to kind of gradually pull back and that the Congolese government will be able to be running that independently at some point. And surgery is one of the missions or emphasis of MSF is obviously something that that I've been kind of more closely involved in. It's actually been sort of a somewhat late addition, so they were much more in dealing with kind of crises in the way of nutritional issues and epidemics, and focusing on surgery is something that they've only come around to more recently. So what is a typical mission like? When one goes out in the field with MSF, and I'll be drawing Syria into this a little bit in case people are wondering, wait, I thought this was supposed to be a talk about Syria. We've only heard it mentioned once, but we're getting there. This is a little bit of a preamble, I guess I would say. But what's it like to be in the field, and what are the living conditions like? And what I would say is here's a picture of the room that I was stayed in the hospital in the Congo, and as I had looked at it as I prepare this and giving a fair number of talks to physician groups, I was going to say, it looks pretty Spartan and basic and maybe a little dirty and kind of tired around the edges. And then as I got prepared to give this talk, I thought, well, gosh, it actually looks pretty much like what might qualify as a nice dorm room. So maybe I should not make too many comments. But it's the accommodations are reasonable. You can appreciate the mosquito net over on the side there, because many of the areas where they work in are malaria is endemic. But it's functional, and what you can't see in some of these slides is, this was the, this particular compound had, rats that were about a foot long that would be kind of scurrying around. And when I was in the Ivory Coast, my roommate was actually a little mouse that would sneak in under the door, and which is another way of I heard this paraphrase very well when I first was doing an orientation, which was somebody said, if you like camping, you'll enjoy working with MSF. And I think there's some, accuracy in that. This is the living conditions that we had in Haiti after the earthquake. So we were in a structure that probably would have been, a 5 or 6 bedroom house. But because of the concern of aftershocks, everybody slept outside, so we were just in a row of mattresses on the ground with mosquito nets, and it worked out just fine until it started to rain, and then it was a little unpleasant, but priorities being what they were, that we generally just tried to bear with it. And this is actually one of the the few pictures from Syria that I was able to bring back. So this was my living quarters or bedroom, which I shared. At that point there were just 2 of us in this room, but there was a 3rd bed in the middle of it. So it's very basic. It's not designed to be luxurious accommodations. And what I would say is it works, and for the expenditure, I think serves its purpose. What about the working conditions? What sorts of things does one find or experience there? And flexibility is really kind of the key thing. So this is a picture of the hospital that I worked in the Congo on the pediatric ward. And if you look carefully there, what you see is that each bed, if you sort of look at this, you say, well, gosh, here's an adult-sized bed. These patients are much smaller than adults. Why would we only want to have 1 in each bed? And not to mention the capacity of the need that existed for the patient. So you would commonly see 2, 3, and sometimes 4 patients in a bed, and/or family members, primarily mothers, sleeping in the bed with them as well. But very Spartan, very basic, but again, allows you the capability to certainly provide health care at a fairly high level, surprisingly. This is a picture of one of the tent wards that was basically what the whole hospital in Haiti that I worked in after the earthquake was like. And so, again, sort of a facility that was sort of put together on the fly. They can do this with operating rooms in a matter of days, but you functionally took what was an open courtyard and turned it into a hospital ward. And again, there's not a lot of privacy, obviously, but in terms of being able to deliver care, it's a very functional setting. And this is actually a picture that mentioned the restrictions on taking pictures in Syria, but this is actually a picture in Turkey. And I included it because this building over here was very much what the hospital that we worked in looked like. So it was a very typical residence. It was a 3-story building. Our operating room was down on the 1st floor. I'm presuming it was probably the living room of this house. Our recovery room was the dining room. Our emergency room was the kitchen. And the patients were then up on the 2nd floor in what I'm sure qualified as bedrooms, and then up on the 3rd floor they had some administrative things and a little kind of a rooftop space where they did laundry and more importantly dried the laundry. But why was it in a building that looked like this? And the answer was because the Syrian government, if it was something that looked like a hospital, would have likely targeted it. And so the idea was to sort of be undercover, but that was very much the kind of the appearance of it, and really it worked very well, except for the poor stretcher bearers who had to carry the patients up and down the stairs as they went in and out of the operating room. And I would say, fortunately, we never saw anyone lost or sliding off, but it was a pretty steep angle that they had to negotiate these patients through. And just so that that people don't say that they didn't see any of Syria, this hillside back over here is Syria. And so this is without trying to paraphrase, one of the major political players of the last decade, but it wasn't quite the scenario where I could see Russia from my backyard, but from Syria, I could see into Turkey and vice versa. It was that close, and so the proximity is there, but as I say, sadly, because of the concerns that I mentioned, it really wasn't possible to take photographs inside the country, which might have embellished this talk considerably. What about in the operating room itself? And hopefully this picture isn't anyone finding too offensive. But what's it like? And the answer is, it's again kind of in keeping with things, relatively Spartan. There's a single light here that you can see illuminates, but maybe not by anywhere near the standards that we're used to. The instruments very basic. There's not a lot of things that are thrown away because that proves to be very expensive. So things are used and reused. There's just anesthesia assistant, so versus having 2 or 3 or 4 people in surgery, as may be the case more typically here, it's the scrub nurse and myself doing the surgery and then anesthetist up above, and we kind of, take turns depending on who's got a free hand of reaching back onto the table to get our equipment and supplies. And I included this slide specifically because it also demonstrates what is the most common operation that's done in a mission with Doctors Without Borders. Anybody want to, non-medical or otherwise, want to speculate what that is? Yeah, cesarean section or cesarean delivery. And so, we tend to think, well, what are the surgical needs? It must be something, related to trauma. It must be something that's warfare, poverty related. And I guess I would say to some degree it's the latter, but it's the most common operation that's performed in these missions is cesarean deliveries. And so, what, that maybe speaks to or underscores is that even in a setting where the society or a country is has any number of major problems, the basic healthcare needs still need to be met, and one of the very most common things that needs addressing surgically is cesarean deliveries. And I could add parenthetically and tragically, and I've seen it many times in missions where the access to this simple procedure is not available in a timely fashion. It's very unfortunate. So what does MSF do well, and what would I say are positives? And I kind of, going back to one of the first slides, I'm not an official spokesman. I'm not formally employed by them. I work and periodically go out and work with the group and have a very, great deal of respect for what they do and where they do it. But it also, as you'll soon see, there's kind of a mixed message, I think, in what it does or it accomplishes. So one of the things that they do very well, though, is having just a great deal of experience and a lot of protocols and means of replicating what was worked in Angola will work very well in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, will also work in Syria. So it's sort of set groups of instruments, groups of people that they utilize, and it translates very well from place to place. And I could, again, throw out what, hopefully without trying to sound unduly negative, but after, Hurricane Katrina went through New Orleans, actually, Doctors Without Borders called up the U.S. and said, would you like us to send a team there to New Orleans to help out? And the answer was, no, again, for better or for worse, but I'm sure had they been on the ground, they could have augmented what effort was provided after that event. So, that kind of speaks to that. And their, supply needs, safety issues, they're very thorough and have a lot of experience of how do you get someone in safely, how do you keep them there safely, or what are the parameters that we need to be, of pulling out or moving away from a given environment. And again, sometimes that, doesn't work perfectly, but they've got a great deal of experience. Wonderful group of people that you work with, and so, I would say almost any enterprise is, based or no better or worse than the people that are in it, but it obviously sub-selects for a very, well-meaning group of individuals with a lot of dedication and maybe I would say in the realm of human rights who are, feel very strongly committed to trying to, maintain, the highest standards that one can globally in that regard. They're also very good at comprehensive care, and so, there's a tendency, I think, for surgical people, for sure, to sort of, feel like what they're doing is far and away the only thing that matters, and everything else is secondary and doesn't really have a role. And there's a joke that spins off of that says, the surgeon who was asked to draw up a list of the 3 greatest surgeons in the history of mankind, and he or she left the room in a half hour, came back, and the person who had asked the question said, well, how did you do? And the response was, well, I could only think of one, the supposition being that individual. But much as that's part of our culture to some degree, what the truth of the matter is that it's very much a whole variety of things that need to be taken into consideration. And mental health care, and this is a picture obviously, or I shouldn't say obviously, but after the earthquake in Haiti, and a gentleman who'd obviously had an amputation of his leg. But to not have a physical therapist on scene after you may have done the life-saving procedure to amputate that leg, his disability will be, could be very substantial, and it's important to be focusing on that as well as mental health. And so in Syria, there was a physical therapist who was, literally even going into the operating room with us and very proactive at trying to optimize the outcomes of these patients. There was a dedicated mental health provider to deal with, one could only imagine the stresses either of the injury itself or what life was like for these people. And so it's, again, not a lot of organizations maybe have the resources or the breadth to be able to do this. And I think whether the healthcare setting is here in Iowa or whether it's in Syria or the Congo, it's very important that these receive at least equal emphasis to some of the more glamorous or glitzy, we did a surgery, we provided a bunch of vaccines. These are very important issues as well.
Tradition.
Ambition.
Exploration. Inspiration.
You feel it when you step on campus at the University of Iowa.
The energy and pride of students inspired by our history.
And excited about our future.
When you join the Hawkeye family, you're a part of it all.
Be a part of it.
Be a part of it.
Be a part of it.
Be a Hawkeye.
There are over 24,000 bridges in Iowa. But only one connects University of Iowa hospitals and clinics to Iowa River Landing. From pediatrics and women's health to cardiology and routine exams, world-class medical care can be found at a new convenient location in Coralville. Iowa River Landing is here, and it's designed just for you. For an appointment, call 319-467-2000.
Attention to health of participants, and so people involved in the care programs that they oversee, and whether that's the stress of the circumstance, I've gotten in over my head, early departures are not frowned upon, the ability to provide care for accidental needle sticks or other illnesses that we may get, which we tend to lose sight of to some degree, and then there's always routinely sort of after you return from one of these missions, a call or email from a mental health provider that says, how are you doing? Do you want to talk? Do you have any issues? Which again is not something that I would say that necessarily every organization would have, and is a real asset, I think, that these things are taken into consideration. Concerns, so looking at the other side of this, well, what might we view as deficiencies, problems, or things that aren't done as well? And again, I would say this is true not only of MSF, but these kind of critiques or criticisms can be brought against a lot of NGOs. And so this whole issue has received some publicity at various levels, and primarily more recently, I would say the last decade, there's been a little bit more introspection, both of people outside of NGOs, but also within them, to say, is what we're doing really as good as we might think? And so certainly with MSF, one of the issues that I could say maybe isn't optimal is that their care is episodic. It's kind of designed for, there's a crisis, there's an emergency, we're going to step in. They patch things up, but then they leave again, and the problem is really no better than it was, rather than trying to do something that actually leads to more longer lasting impact. And in particular, education is one of the big areas where I think that, did they set up medical schools? Do they try to train people? It happens to some degree, but it's not really a formal emphasis. And I guess being a bit of an educator at heart, I wish that was slightly different. Does it promote local brain drain? So if you might imagine, if I've said that, the bulk of the people in any site are natives of the country that they're working in, and so if you are saying, gosh, we're going to hire an anesthesia person and some nurses and a pharmacist and a whole variety of other people to run the hospital that MSF has, and we're paying them at a rate that may be above the local market rate for those individuals, where do you think they all come from? And the answer is from the existing healthcare system. So you may find that you're kind of skimming some of the cream off of the crop locally to supply your facility, but that what you don't see is what the net effect down the line is, that the local resources may be being drained a bit. Does it facilitate what I've called the bad guys? So are there negative ramifications, and does it lead to prolonging of conflicts? And there's been, a number of examples. Rwanda, probably after the genocide, was one of the main ones where this was brought to the fore, where the camps that had been set up for displaced persons were very quickly infiltrated by a whole variety of military individuals, and aid and resources were going not necessarily to the people in need, but to kind of further or perpetuate the conflict. Somalia is another example I've heard discussed where the aid organizations, including MSF, were presented with a circumstance of, yes, your truck of supplies can go through, but our military group needs payment of X amount of dollars per ton of material that's shipped through. And then you say, gosh, what is the priority here? Do we pay these funds to realizing it's going to benefit others, realizing it may be drawing things out? And as I've kind of mentioned, displacement of the local healthcare system kind of implicit in their efforts locally. So, finally, people may be saying, I thought this talk was about Syria, and we are going to get there here for a bit, but what about the conflict? And this is more broadly now that it began around March of 2011 as a spin-off of the broader Arab Spring movement, and in particular, I think really took a kind of a very different turn than some of the other countries in the Middle East that were affected, and that there was a very brutal repression of the early demonstrations, and including some very the sort of university/school-age students, but down into 9, 10, and 11-year-olds who were out on the streets as part of this, who were in essence gunned down or imprisoned. And I had the occasion to speak to some families who'd had children who said, they just disappeared. Our son disappeared on such and such a date, and so it was a very kind of an extreme act that was undertaken that's obviously was been perpetuated. And estimates, the figure is probably now more like 120,000 deaths that have occurred since the start of the Civil War. 2 million people who have fled the country, and then many of them, just in refugee camps just out over the border in neighboring countries, and another over 4 million who are internally displaced at this point. And again, it was very evident driving through the country, almost all the way along the border, you would see camps that were set up, and in part, I think that probably the majority of those people would like to get out of the country if they could, but many of the surrounding countries just feel like their resources have been overextended, and so it's just not possible. And as I put these figures up here, and again, to kind of keep this in context, Syria has gotten a tremendous amount of publicity, and recently, and justifiably so. But that figure of 100,000 deaths in the eastern Congo, an area that doesn't get quite as much publicity, the figure there is there's probably about 500,000 deaths a year in that region still from rebel activities, from military activities, and it's sort of one of these things you just don't even hear about. So the relative scale of some of the human rights issues, globally, I think are perhaps a little bit skewed because of the relative importance that they may have in the bigger kind of global setting, I guess is what I would say. But whether it's Darfur or the Congo, places like that many times have had years and years and years of figures that are not different from this or more, but just not quite as much attention, sadly. And that's kind of a sidebar. I don't really have a solution to that, but I can't help but bring that up looking at these numbers. Also in Syria, medical workers and medical facilities have been targeted by the Syrian government, and so 60% of Syria's public hospitals have been damaged or destroyed. Many healthcare workers, including large numbers of physicians, nurses, and other skilled individuals, opted to leave the country. And I must say, having said that, there's also been a very strong effort by the Syrian diaspora in the medical realm to provide support back into the country. So facilities that are funded by people who've left the country are not hard to find. And so again, I don't want that to sound like a negative statement, but I think I would say, were any of us in that circumstance, what might be our choice if we had the resources to leave? That it sadly is that a population that has more mobility and perhaps opportunities, many of them have taken the opportunity to, or made the choice to leave. So what is MSF's role in Syria at present? They're staffing 6 hospitals in 4 clinics that are in areas of opposition control. They're also remotely providing support to 27 hospitals and 56 medical clinics, so that's primarily technical support, supplies, and medications, and those facilities are primarily in rebel-controlled areas, but it also includes some government-controlled areas, and then areas where the control is certainly very much in flux or mixed. And you can see figures there that were done in a year-long period between June of 2012 and 2013. So 3,500 surgeries. They assisted on 1,400 deliveries, provided 77,000 vaccines for children for measles. And again, based on some conversations I was having earlier with some people, prior to the conflict, Syria was in many ways a very progressive country, and their healthcare system was very progressive. And so if you said, why would there be the need for 77,000 measles vaccines, prior to this, the civil war breaking out, my guess is that almost every child would have been, immunized in Syria. But, displacement, being in refugee camps, local healthcare, that sort of routine things all tend to fall apart, unfortunately. So what about my own experience in Syria and getting there, and how did all that work? And the answer is, it kind of alluded to that, but it was a very simple would you like to go? And in a matter of a few days, then the itinerary arranged, and it kind of speaking to the budgetary constraints, it was a overnight flight to Europe, from Newark to Paris, from a 4-hour layover there, and then a flight to Istanbul, an 8-hour layover in Istanbul, a flight that got in at 2 in the morning in eastern Turkey, and then being picked up there, and had about 3 hours to sleep, an hour briefing, and then we were in a car and on the way to Syria. And so, again, there's not a lot of frills, as I've mentioned, but one wouldn't or necessarily expect that should be the case. From a standpoint of briefings, it started with a phone call from the people in New York. There was another phone call from Paris, another briefing once I was actually in Turkey in the base, and then finally once I actually was inside Syria. But a great emphasis on kind of the do's and don'ts, and in particular, I've already mentioned photographs, sadly, but it was a security of what's the situation on the ground, who is it that's around and active, what is there going on in the way of military activity, of chemical warfare issues that are existing. So lots of background in that regard. And kind of in this whole preparation realm, this is another picture from inside our residence. This was from what we called, a picture inside what's called the safe room. So in the building we lived in, there was a designated room that we were to go to if there was an active, conflict engagement, warfare that kind of came to our doorstep. And this was there was a shelf inside the room, and there were 12 of these bags. Anybody want to hazard what they were? I would mention, incidentally, that I'm not sure that the NFL would appreciate their logo. I don't know if everyone could read that, but it said 49ers. I found that kind of an interesting cultural juxtaposition. No sooner did I arrive in Syria, and here's the NFL being indirectly promoted. But any thoughts on what was inside the bags? They weren't helmets and shoulder pads, I'll tell you that. The hospital I've kind of talked about, those first, I think, couple components. The focus of the facility, though, was just on burn care. So it had been decided within the community that a hospital of what was called the Red Crescent, which is a sort of an equivalent of the Red Cross, would be doing all the acute trauma care. There was another community hospital that was still functioning, and they'd opted to say, we'd like to keep doing more routine things. And so our facility was deemed with burn care, which is very labor intensive and kind of a specialized entity. And so exclusively what we saw. And the patients that we had there were kind of mixed into two different groups. There were pediatric patients. Most of those were toddlers who were living in refugee camps. And because of the close proximities of cooking fires, pots of boiling liquid, and then small children, there were a lot of splash burns. And then there were, some that clearly had been involved in more probably military activities, and the bulk of the patients otherwise were men, though, in sort of the 15 to 35-year-old age range, and it was evident that many of them had been involved in some military explosion of some sort. This is a child from a mission that I did in the Congo, who had been in a house. Their house was attacked by rebels. The house caught on fire. It collapsed on this child and killed the father. The mother survived and brought this child in, and this had happened sadly about 10 days previously, and he wound up not surviving. But it's very easy, I think, to get a kind of a clinical, when you see numbers of how many deaths have there been, or what all's going on, or what would be the effect of further escalation in military activity. It's pretty easy to say, well, that that really might not be such a bad thing. But when you again come face to face with it and realize what the true ramifications of that are, or see it personified, and I guess I would also use this in this bigger realm of human rights. This is also the time to, I think, underscore that any conflict primarily affects civilian populations. They're the ones who suffer most. For every military person that I've treated in these places, there's probably 9 or 10 civilians that have wound up treating. And so to think that people aren't going to get caught in the middle of this is not, an informed way to think. And so, I think I would just say, one needs to, give pause to that and realize, again, our efforts, may be able to do something to assist with that, but, far better still would be a way to perhaps prevent it ever occurring in the first place. So perspectives, and I'm about to wrap up, and I apologize, it looks like I've run over an hour here, but what did I come away with then, and what sorts of impressions in what was obviously a very short period of time in the country of about a little under 2 weeks. But the team that was there working with, and again, I would say this is both the people from outside, but as well, very much the Syrians there, incredibly efficient, dedicated, and so you don't have this feeling like we're trying to help these individuals, they don't want to help themselves, anything but. This was very much they were so appreciative of us as outsiders contributing to what I think they viewed as, their own problem. Having said that, it's not, I think, one can't come away and say every last part of Syria right now is, in turmoil and is in a state of instability. There's, sort of a natural tendency for normalcy to kind of come in and try to take over, and I think that, that hopefully that will be something that can kind of, get a broader scope. But I'm thinking of the one day in the hospital, one of the head nurses brought in ice cream sundaes from their little kind of store that they ordinarily had run there, and I thought, well, wow, this is one of the last things I expected to see was an ice cream sundae. But it just kind of brought back the most of what people want to do and want to try to preserve is not maybe so politically based, but rather just to live a routine existence. As an individual there, are you thinking about every last minute, gosh, is a bomb about to drop or what's going to happen? And the answer is no. And I think I would say it's probably like what most of us, how we view our days. We don't every time we get in the car say, gosh, maybe I'm going to be in an accident. Instead, we kind of think about what do we have to focus on and be doing. And it was very much the case there. And I've kind of highlighted this, but as a surgeon, we're really just such a tenuous part of the whole effort that goes into this, and so much of the groundwork is in having good communications and people that can keep a generator running and people that can figure out how can we have a water supply to be able to to use in the various tasks that's necessary. So and in that regard, for again anybody in the room who may be thinking about, well, is MSF something that I'd like to do? It doesn't mean you have to be a medical medical person. And in fact, the person I traveled out of the country with was a woman who was kind of involved in looking at it in the many field camps or the internally displaced persons camps and trying to assess their medical needs and see what what kinds of things we could provide to assist them. And I got to talking with her, and she was an American. I said, "What was your background?" And she actually had been in the movie business and lived in Manhattan and had been a movie production for 10 years. And then had just kind of gotten a little bit of a sort of a change of emphasis in her life and a calling to maybe do something a little different. And I said, well, how did you think that you'd be able to do okay with, or what kind of experience, or how did you think that your movie experience would help you in MSF? She said, well, what I was used to doing in the movie business was telling everybody else what to do every day. And she said it works perfectly because that's what basically I do right now is, advise a whole variety of other people and coordinate them and tell them how to get done what needs to get accomplished. And so, in that regard, anybody who is, might be thinking about this, don't feel like there's a lot of former, business individuals and people from all kinds of backgrounds who can fill roles there.
With that, I would like to suggest that if any of you have questions, you might stay, but if we would, just please give Dr. Lawrence a round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you.